Welcome back to another Explainer. We love taking these wildly complex, fascinating topics and really breaking them down so you can master them. And today we are stepping into the incredibly meticulous, high-stakes world of forensic medicine. Right off the bat, I want you to completely change how you look at the human body. Because to a forensic pathologist, the body isn't just tissue and bone, right? It's a document. It is a literal historical record. Every scrape, every bruise, every cut, it's like a sentence written in the flesh. And today, we're going to learn exactly how to translate that language to uncover the absolute truth.
And to learn this language, we are going to dive straight into a real-world case study, a genuine locked room mystery. So, picture the scene. A young man is found dead in the bathroom of his locked apartment. There is a massive pool of blood and a razor blade lying just inches from his right hand. Now, the cause of death is painfully clear. An immense, incredibly deep cut to his left wrist that completely severed the radial artery. Immediately, the victim's family vehemently accuses his roommate of murder, absolutely swearing that the young man was perfectly happy. And the police? Well, they're highly suspicious too, mostly because of the sheer depth and terrifying severity of that fatal wound. But then, the forensic pathologist arrives. He looks closely at the left wrist, and he notices 4 tiny, superficial, parallel scratches right next to that massive fatal wound. And immediately, he rules it a suicide.
Okay, let's dive into this because it is absolutely fascinating. To understand exactly how those tiny scratches completely absolved the roommate of murder, we need to map out our game plan. Think of this as your high-yield study guide for the day. We're going to define what a wound actually is, differentiate between blunt and sharp force trauma, figure out the crucial difference between incised wounds and stab wounds, and finally identify the undeniable hallmarks of suicidal versus homicidal trauma. Let's get started.
All right, we have to start with the basics, and here is a common pitfall right out of the gate. Look at how we define a wound. In the medical world, the definition is actually incredibly narrow. Medically speaking, a wound is simply a break in the continuity of the skin or mucous membrane. That's literally it. But legally, the legal definition is vastly broader. In a courtroom, a wound encompasses basically any harm or damage inflicted upon the body. So that means burns, bone fractures, internal organ ruptures, and yes, even psychological injuries all count as legal wounds. But for our pathology work today, we are zeroing in specifically on physical, mechanical injuries.
So, mechanical injuries generally fall into 2 main camps. The first is blunt force trauma. These are injuries caused by unsharpened, blunt objects. Think sticks, stones, fists, or hitting the pavement. And we break this down into 3 distinct categories. First up, abrasions. These are just scrapes. It's the destruction of that very superficial top layer of the skin, the epidermis, usually due to friction. So think of a scratch from a fingernail, a sliding graze from a motorcycle accident, or even an imprint abrasion, which is wild. That's where something like a tire mark stamps its exact pattern right onto the skin. Next, we have contusions, which is just the medical term for bruises. And finally, lacerations, which are actual tears in the tissue. Let's actually look a little closer at those bruises.
Now, this is one of the most fascinating aspects of forensics, and definitely a high-yield point to remember. The age of a bruise follows a strict biochemical timeline. It is not guesswork. A contusion happens when delicate subcutaneous blood vessels rupture, but, and this is key, the top layer of skin remains perfectly intact, so blood leaks and pools beneath the skin. When it's fresh, it's red or purple, right? That's from the raw, leaked hemoglobin. But your body's macrophages immediately swoop in and start breaking that hemoglobin down. By day 4, and it takes exactly this long, an enzyme converts that heme into biliverdin, which turns the bruise green. By day 7, another enzyme converts it into bilirubin, turning it yellow. Do you see what this means? A green bruise on day 1 is medically impossible. If someone claims they were beaten yesterday, but they show you a green bruise, science literally proves their timeline is completely false.
Okay, now let's contrast the third type of blunt trauma, lacerations, with sharp force trauma. A laceration is a tear. It results from crushing, stretching, or shearing from a blunt weapon. It is fundamentally different from an incised wound, which is a clean cut from a sharp blade like a knife or a piece of glass. With a blunt force laceration, the margins are irregular, they're jagged. The hair bulbs at the edges are completely crushed. And interestingly, lacerations actually bleed a bit less initially, because those crushed blood vessels rapidly spasm and pull back. An incised wound, on the other hand, regular, clean-cut edges, cleanly severed hairs, and it bleeds profusely because those cleanly sliced vessels just remain wide open. Incised wounds also feature this thing called tailing, where the cut gets shallower at the very end, and that's a massive clue, because it tells us the exact direction of the weapon's stroke.
Now, what is truly fascinating here, if you want a real clinical pearl for the autopsy room, is the defining feature that separates these two injuries. Look at the bridging tissues. In a laceration, because the tissue is tearing rather than being cleanly sliced, the tougher components underneath, like intact nerves, blood vessels, and elastic connective tissues, they actually resist tearing much better than the surrounding fat, so they stretch across the depth of the wound like little bridges. In a sharp incised wound, those bridges are completely absent. The knife just slices right through all of it. Finding those bridging tissues is the ultimate undeniable proof that you are looking at a blunt force laceration.
Let's move to the other major type of sharp force trauma, stab wounds. Unlike an incised wound where the cut is longer on the surface of the skin, a stab wound is defined by its depth. The track penetrating into the body is significantly longer than the visible cut you see on the outside. But here's where it gets incredibly tricky and where skin tension comes into play. Our skin actually has an underlying directional arrangement of collagen fibers. We call these Langer's lines. If a knife enters parallel to these lines, the wound just looks like a tiny narrow slit. But if the exact same knife enters perpendicular to these lines, the skin tension actually pulls the edges apart, making the wound gape widely open. This gaping can easily deceive a novice examiner into assuming some massive weapon was used, when in reality it was just a small blade crossing those Langer's lines.
And this brilliantly illustrates why our modern technology is just so absolutely vital. We aren't just relying on plastic rulers and our naked eyeballs anymore. By our 2026 standards, forensic pathologists are using 3D photogrammetry and structured light surface scanning to create permanent, to-scale, true-color 3D models of these stab wounds. It is wild. This allows for virtual trajectory reconstruction long after the autopsy is over. And remember that bruise color timeline we talked about? We don't just eyeball the color green anymore. We are now using fiber optic reflectance spectrometry to objectively quantify the exact biochemical concentrations right there in the skin, making bruise dating mathematically exact.
So why does this intense level of precision even matter? Well, because getting it wrong has catastrophic courtroom consequences. Emergency room doctors frequently and incorrectly chart basically any wound that requires stitches as a laceration. But remember what we just established? A laceration is blunt force trauma. If a patient comes in after being stabbed with a knife, it is an incised or a stab wound. If that ER doctor charts it as a laceration, imagine the defense attorney in court. They're going to stand up, look at the jury and say, "Your Honor, my client is accused of stabbing the victim with a knife, yet the medical report clearly states it was a laceration, an injury caused exclusively by a blunt object. My client is innocent." In forensics, terminology isn't just semantics, guys. It is literally the difference between justice and a murderer walking free. And the examiners know this, which is exactly why they love to test students with what I call the split laceration trap. This is a classic. They'll describe a wound on a victim's scarp. It's got perfectly straight, regular margins, and it bleeds profusely. And then they tell you it was caused by a blunt wooden baseball bat. Wait, how is that mechanically possible? Well, in areas where the skin is stretched incredibly tight directly over a hard bone, like your scalp, your shin, or your chin, a blunt strike will literally split the skin in a perfectly straight line, perfectly mimicking a sharp incised wound. It is a brilliant trap. The only way to expose the truth is to look deep inside that wound. And what are you looking for? You guessed it, bridging tissues and crushed hair follicles.
Okay, let's take all of this science, all these clinical pearls, and transition back towards solving our opening mystery. How do we definitively tell if a fatal sharp force injury was inflicted by an attacker or by the victim themselves? We have to compare the signs. In a homicidal cutthroat, for example, the cut is usually lower on the neck and very horizontal. The depth is extremely deep, often actually scoring the cervical vertebrae underneath, and the killer usually takes the weapon with them. In a suicide, the cut is usually higher up, it slants downwards, the depth is uneven, and the weapon is almost always found right there at the scene.
So the crucial point here is looking for behavioral evidence that is physically written on the body. A homicide victim fights back, right? So we look for defense wounds. These are instinctive sharp trauma cuts found on the palms of the hands or the backs of the forearms as the victim desperately tries to block the blade. A suicide victim obviously doesn't have these. Instead, they have something entirely different. Hesitation marks. These are superficial little trial cuts usually found right at the start of the fatal wound.
Let's move back to our locked bathroom and see how all of this builds our final conclusion. The blood, the razor, the accused roommate. I want you to look at the victim's left wrist again, but this time, look at it through your new forensic lens. We have that immense, deep cut that severed the radial artery.
But right next to it, right adjacent to the massive fatal wound, are those 4 tiny, superficial, parallel scratches. Apply your new skills here. There are no defense wounds on the victim's palms, the fatal cut has a tailing mark clearly showing the direction of the stroke, and those 4 scratches, what are they really?
They are classic hesitation marks. Think about it. A murderer acting with violent, homicidal intent simply does not hesitate. They don't gently scratch their victim 4 times before striking. They strike forcefully and decisively. But a person attempting to take their own life, they are fighting millions of years of deeply ingrained human evolution. They have to overcome an immense psychological and physiological survival barrier. And to conquer that barrier, they will often make several light, superficial test cuts across their skin. They're basically testing the sharpness, gauging the pain, and trying to ready their resolve before finally committing to that deep, fatal stroke.
Those scratches were the hesitation marks. The combination of those tentative cuts and the tailing of the deep wound provided absolute, undeniable scientific proof of a tragic suicide. The roommate was completely and entirely absolved of murder, and the case was closed. It's just an incredible testament to the power of observation, isn't it? The human body holds a perfect, unflinching record of its final moments, totally indifferent to lies or accusations or assumptions. It really leaves you to wonder, what other secrets are hiding in plain sight, just waiting for someone who actually knows how to read the written flesh? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I will see you in the next one.